Sind wir hybrid oder was? Ja. Michael, sind wir hybrid? Ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor Aghion, welcome to this special event by the Schumpeter Society, namely having one of the key authors that reinvigorated Schumpeter in the world here in our halls, and to learn from the mouth of the master about how one can deal with Schumpeter in modern times. It's a great pleasure having you here, because what you did was something, I have to say, we've been waiting for, is putting Schumpeter into more rigor with regards to modeling, to introduce it into modern growth models, where only before verbal interpretations have very important ones, but still not sufficient. And what you have achieved is to get a high attention worldwide about it. So we are happy, how to say, to have you here and to learn from you now the new ways, if you have not read it already in your book, in your articles. Now you will ask, okay, why is it? And I had 6-8 pages of something which my staff had prepared, but when I read it, I said, no, forget about it. So I changed over to something much shorter, which is to say, what is it that the central bank gets so much interested in productivity? What is so special about it? And I think the reason is that the statement that productivity has decreased, at least for the last 30, 40 years. It was not constant before, but over the 30, 40 years it decreased substantially. And in many cases it became to very low, if you consider productivity as total federal productivity and this part of it. In many countries it's time negative. Well, the reason why this is of special interest to the central banks is that we conjecture that it has a bearing on R star, the natural interest rate, which brings notionally financial supply and demand at full employment and stable prices into equilibrium. And this R star has also decreased substantially over recent years, from about 3 to 4%, in some countries 5%, to low levels, and in Europe to negative levels. And this, of course, how to say, has major implication for us. Most importantly, the implications, what it is that with a negative R star, our normalization of monetary policy will be pretty limited. As you may have heard recently, the central banks of the world moved from expensive monetary policy into a normalization, and normalization in Europe means that we are moving out of buying assets, so increasing our balance sheet. We are moving out of providing subsidized credits to central banks, and we are moving out by having decided to have the first increase in interest rates over the last 11 years. By July, 21st of July, we'll do it. But will this lead to a normalization of the monetary policy? Not really, because if R star remains negative, we still have constraints in how we use the interest rate instrument, because if push comes to shove, we may be obliged again to have negative interest rates, or to have again purchases of assets, additional assets, or to have further subsidies to loans. So the only way how to do it is getting the A star upper, and getting A star up, one of the key conjectured candidates is productivity. The links is empirical and not so straight, and the estimates have shown that's not so clear. In my simple understanding as an economist, I think having a high interest rate, a positive high interest rate without productivity won't be possible. So as a result of it, there's a link. Of course, the other links as well has to do with demography, population aging, or simply monetary overhang. And the question now is this the only way why the national banks are interested in productivity? No, because we also have some conjectures that our monetary policy in the past may have contributed to a fall in productivity. And the simple buzzword to use there is zombie firms. So too much liquidity allows enterprises to stay in the market, and the result of it, the resources, financial resources, but also human resources do not move to the best use of these resources. And whether this is the case, the empirical evidence is still mixed. Some clearly see it, others say, well, actually, we don't see it too well. But this is a critical part, because if this is correct, with our monetary policy may have created actually, or be part and participant of this downside loop, that putting more money to it leads to more zombie firms, leads to falling productivity. In order to counteract it with a falling A star, then leads to further money into the place. This could not yet been fully analyzed, because, and I'll come back to that very quickly before I end, this is part of the empirical evidence we want to build up in the national banks. This leads to the other question then, okay, once our interest at the top is recognized in productivity, what can then central banks do in order to address this problem with productivity and the need to raise it? Well, the first one is clearly research. And one of the approaches we still have not yet succeeded in implementing, but I'm still hoping for, is to have a line of research which leads from the monetary impulse provided by the central banks, by the European system, to banks, from there on to enterprises and their liquidity position, from there down what it does then to the changes at enterprise level, and how does it lead to adjustments in investments, adjustments in human capital, and measure it. And I'm optimistic because without the first part, on the part of enterprises, I've participated in a number of countries, including some of the Arabic countries, where we could see it, to what extent, how to say, what has been proven in other cases, changes at enterprise level are the elements of productivity growth to the largest extent possible. The second way how we are doing it is through institutional, how to say, support. And you may have learned that the Austrian National Bank became the seat not only of the Fiscal Council, but also of the Productivity Council, something which should have been established in Austria for some time. We are one of the last few European member countries that installed the Productivity Council. And its job will be, how to say, to learn what the others have been doing, to learn what the others know, but also to put into work some of the perhaps new innovations of not only tracing productivity, but also coming forward with policy proposals. And last but not least, we did a little start in this direction. I was also a cause of a stock taking with 9 hypotheses, what drives productivity as a first way forward. So this explains why we're extremely happy that you have you here. We're looking forward to your presentation, to your ideas, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to the panel discussion. Thanks for the panelists for participating, and for the discussion thereafter. And I hope also during the reception session we have time for discussion. With this, I hand over to you, Michael. Thank you much. Thank you.
So I'm aware you don't come to hear me, but Professor Philippe Aghion, I want to just make a few introductory remarks. Well, as the governor said, it's organized by the Schumpeter Society, Vienna, which I think I want to just mention a few items what the society is doing. Probably the most important thing is that we have been sending since 1991 visiting professors to Harvard, and Philipp was a professor in Harvard for many years, so I think we're particularly glad that this continued link with Harvard is established. By now, about 37 research fellows or visiting professors have gone to Harvard in the whole spectrum of social science disciplines. So it's not just economics, or political science, sociology, economic history, more or less encompassing what Joseph Schumpeter stands for, that he's an economist beyond economics. The other thing which we do, and I think some of you might have been present, was we award annually a Schumpeter Prize, and just a month ago we had an event over here, thanks to the generosity of the central bank who supports us, and it was awarded to Margrethe Vestager, the EU Commissioner for Competition and Digital Affairs, who gave a very, very nice speech. And also, newly we awarded such prizes to junior women scientists, and there were some very good crop of young economists who we honored with that situation. But today we are having another event, which is a Schumpeter lecture, and it's delivered, just coming to a short introduction of somebody who everybody is probably well familiar with, or Philippe Aghion, who now is professor at Collège de France. And at the same time, he is professor at LSE, London School of Economics, since about 2015. He moved from Harvard, where he had been the previous 15 years, the Wagner Professor of Economics. And on top of that, he's also professor at INSEAD. How he manages is a miracle, but you will see he's a person of enormous energy, apart from his distinction of being an outstanding economist. What we celebrate here in terms of his work is that he really is a trailblazer of the branch of what is now called Schumpeterian economics, or sometimes called neo-Schumpeterian economics. Probably it's a bit like Keynes economics and neo-Keynesian economics. But I think many of you, I can see many economists over you, will be very familiar that he has been developing this branch of research and teaching for a long time. There's a thick book used in graduate studies written jointly with Peter Howitt called Endogenous Growth Theory, which already elaborates all the sort of deeper theoretical understanding of Schumpeterian economics. And of course, he has published so many papers in many, many areas, which really made that branch of economics a new field in which many, many economists are working, and many young people are very attracted to it. Now, it's not up to me to dwell what it stands for, Schumpeterian economics, because that's your task, and you'll see in your lecture that you will cover all that. But in a nutshell, it's basically focuses on structural change in all its dimensions. Yeah? You can say it's underneath it is a marriage between macroeconomics and detailed microeconomic research in industrial economics, in particular on the impact of technological change, innovation, the impact on labor, on employment, on inequality, etc. And I think all these fields are covered in this book, which I make a little reference. And of course, it has also the title of today's lecture, The Power of Creative Destruction, written jointly with two co-authors, Céline, Antonin, and Simon Bunel, and has a subtitle, Economic Upheaval and the Wealth of Nations, so there is a bit of a link to Smith as well, yeah? And probably Joseph Schumpeter saw himself in terms of the grandeur of his oeuvre, in a way, as a link to Adam Smith. What is interesting is that there's a little graph below it, because it says economic upheaval and wealth of nations, and that graph shows a big contraction of the economy, a spike downwards, but then a recovery which goes much beyond the previous trajectory. So I think what the book also shows a rather optimistic view of what is creative destruction is about, and I think this could be very well a topic which we might discuss in our panel later on. So one last thing I want to say about Philippe Aghion, and also what is clearly demonstrated in this book, is that he's, of course, by background, a theorist, a brilliant theorist. But you can see in this book and in many of his works, he now collaborates with many excellent applied economists. And I think to make a point, to really come across a wider audience, you have to make sure that theory is really tested or put in relation to empirical facts and with very sound applied economic techniques. And you will see that here, and you will see it in the lecture, which is coming here. And I think it's a testimony that as an economist, just like Joseph Schumpeter, he wants to reach a wider audience, policymakers, but also a wider public, because there is no point to do theory for its own sake. So we look forward to your lecture, and it will be a brilliant lecture, as I'm used to hear from you on other occasions. So thank you very much for coming.
I don't know. So thanks so much for inviting me. It's of course extremely moving for me to be in Schumpeter's place, where it all started. So I hope I do justice to Joseph Schumpeter and his legacy. So I call this talk Rethinking Capitalism, the Power of Creative Destruction. And it's based on this book called The Power of Creative Destruction, written with Céline Antonin. She's a researcher at Sciences Po and Collège de France with me, and Simon Bunel, who is a researcher at INSEE, Banque de France, and which is the sister institution to this one, and Collège de France with me. And this book is based on more than 30 years. It's been 35 years since I started to work with Peter Howitt. And also, at Collège de France, it's a very special institution because you are supposed to teach the public. Anybody can come to your lectures. And so I tried myself to teach without equations and to put, recent research accessible to the public at large. And so, in fact, that generated lots of slides, lots of PowerPoints, and this book was also partly, my co-authors wrote a lot, but we made use also a lot of the slides that we put together over the 5 years I taught at the Collège de France since I came back from Harvard. Okay. So here is a young Schumpeter. I could have, I guess, I'm sure you have younger picture. I'm sure you must have him with short pants or whatever. That's the picture I have of him. And we know, we owe a lot to Joseph Schumpeter. I must tell you that I am not an exegete of Schumpeter. I have not been someone who say, oh, here he said this, here he said that. What struck me is this notion, this term creative destruction. Creative destruction is the term that Schumpeter used to refer to the process whereby new technologies make old technologies obsolete. New goods replace old goods. So there is the idea that the new is in conflict with the old with creative destruction. Okay, and he developed that concept in various writings, particularly in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And so, but when I studied economics, there was no such thing as a Schumpeterian growth model. It didn't exist. We would study Harold Domar and Solow and Ramsey, Cass-Koopmans, all were models where growth was driven by capital accumulation. There was was no, but of course Solow, in his 1956 paper, tells you that under reasonable assumptions on capital accumulation, reasonable decreasing assumption, the decreasing returns to capital accumulation, you could not explain long-run growth with capital accumulation alone. You need something else, which Solow would call technical progress. But Solow would not tell you where technical progress was coming from. And then, well, okay, so what do we do then, okay? And so I asked the question, but you know, there is this guy, this Schumpeter guy, he talked about innovation. But he said, yeah, but we know, that was a curiosity. In industrial organization, I took Dick Cave's course. We would hear about Schumpeter here and there, but there was no model, nothing. So in fact, when I became assistant professor in 1987, my neighbor was Peter Howitt. He was a macroeconomist. He was very much into search theory, monetary and search. So he would do a lot of Bellman equation. I had done some Bellman working on experimentation on kind of two-arm bandit type of problems. But I had done I.O. I was trained very much as an I.O. person. And I knew that you could put I.O. in growth. But it was not so clear for me how you do it. And I looked, and so I did my thesis partly on contract theory and in I.O., in our industrial organization. But I wanted to put that in. So I came to see, Peter was my neighbor. He was visiting 1 year from, over 87, 88. Peter Howitt was visiting professor at MIT from Western Ontario in Canada. It was my first year as an assistant professor. And one day I came to his office and I said, look, why don't we try to model, to create a growth model that embodies creative destruction? And from scratch, we started to write such a model. So we did it during the year that Peter was at MIT, which was 87, 88, okay? So the model revolved around three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation. Each innovator builds upon previous innovations. You stand on giant shoulders of your predecessors, okay? First idea. Second idea, innovations do not come from heaven. They result from entrepreneurial activities that are largely motivated by the prospects of innovation rents. If you innovate, for a while you get monopoly rents because you have a better product, a better technology, etc., a better way of organizing things, and that gives you some rents. And the prospect of these rents is what induces you to invest in R&D and other types of innovative, investments, okay? So that's the second idea. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technologies, make old technologies become obsolete. But you see right away, I will take some water, you see, because I'm a kind of old, I get dehydrated. So I need to drink some water. With this. Sorry for this, not very elegant, but okay. So, and so you see, is at the heart, what's very interesting is that at the heart of the growth process, described as I just did, there is a contradiction. Because on the one hand, you need innovation rents to motivate innovation. But on the other hand, yesterday's innovators are very tempted to use their rents to prevent subsequent innovations because they don't want themselves to be subject to creative destruction. And regulating capitalism, it's primarily about how to manage this contradiction. How you can both give rents to new innovators, but make sure they will not misuse these rents to prevent subsequent innovation. Whether you talk, and we'll see, about inequality, about secular stagnation, about middle income trap, about green innovation, you come across this contradiction and how you can overcome this contradiction. And you see, Schumpeterian economics, it's mainly about this, how you deal with this bloody contradiction. You see, you need to give the rent, but you don't want the rents to be misused. And that's the heart of the growth process. You see what I mean? So all the previous growth theory economy, they just missed it because they didn't understand that this was the main problem at the heart of the growth process. Okay? So in fact, Schumpeter himself, you may have your own interpretation, and whenever I talk about Schumpeter in this place, of course I do with extreme care because you know much more than I do. My own feeling was that Schumpeter was kind of a pessimistic because he thought that the first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would successfully bribe the state and prevent subsequent innovation. So he was not optimistic about capitalism. Okay? And in fact, we believe, and that's what we argue in this book, we are what we could call Gramscian optimists, like Gramsci. We are optimists of the will, not Panglossian optimists, the optimists that believe that everything will go well anyway. It's kind of, that's when we're going back to what you were saying. We are fighting optimists. We believe there are forces that, if they are activated, can help avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. It doesn't mean that they will be mobilized, but there are forces that can help us avoid this pessimistic prediction that, you know, first innovators would turn into entrenched conglomerates that would prevent innovation and stop the growth process, okay? And so, so what we do in this book is to use the notion of creative destruction and the paradigm that I just outlined to do three main things. The first one is to revisit some main enigma of economic history. The second thing is to question some common wisdoms. And the third one is to rethink the future of capitalism, okay? So let me go right away to the enigma, okay? So a first enigma is the industrial takeoff enigma. I wonder if I should not use a glass, you know, because otherwise, I know myself, each time I will try to drink, I will, most of the water will go on my suit and not on me. Well, not, I'm becoming jealous of my suit. Yeah. That's technical progress. Okay, so, so the first enigma is this. We know through the work in particular of Madison that we know that, you know, growth, there hasn't been much growth of per capita GDP worldwide up to 1820. I mean, you had some episodes of growth, Venice, here, there. They were never lasting, okay? And growth really took off in 1820, and it happened in Europe. Why not in China? China was a place where there had been many inventions. The wheel was invented in China long, long before. The compass, many things had been invented in China. Why is it that it was not in China that the takeoff took place? And here we talk about that in chapter 2 of the book. And the name of Joel Mokyr is very important. Joel Mokyr is a great historian of growth and technology, okay, and innovation. And Joel Mokyr, what's very interesting is that he has various writings. But if you put them together, he tells you, he solves the puzzle in a sense. But he solved the puzzle very much along the lines of the paradigm that I outlined. That's why I put it first. First thing is that Joel Mokyr tells you that in Europe, there were institutions that would favor cumulative innovation. You had open universities, relatively open. You had the Encyclopedia Britannica and the French Encyclopedia of Diderot, which would codify knowledge and make it easier for new potential innovators to build upon previous knowledge. All that existed very much in Europe. Okay, and so that's what he explains. So part of Joel Mokyr writings are about explaining why in Europe you had institution postage, progress in postage technologies, why you had institutions that would favor cumulative innovation. The second thing is that in England and then France, you had institutions that would protect property rights on innovation. The big problem is that if I innovate, and I innovate under Louis XIV, there is no point because Louis XIV will expropriate me completely. This, you know, aristocrats living in Versailles, you know, they will just take everything from me, and I have zero incentive to innovate. But you know, in England, you had the Glorious Revolution that protected property rights. In France, you have the French Revolution followed by Napoleon. By then, you had institutions that would protect property rights. And that was crucial to get the fact that if you innovate, you can get innovation rents. And then it allowed for the patent system to develop and other things. So again, in Europe, before elsewhere, you had institutions that would make it possible to have innovations motivated by the prospects of innovation rents. And the third one is creative destruction. In China, not only would existing firms try to oppose new innovations, but even the emperor of China would oppose new innovation because he would always feel threatened by new innovators. And there, Joel Mokyr tells you, but in Europe, you could not do that because you had competition between European countries. If an inventor was persecuted in France, he could go to Prussia, or he could go to Russia, or he could go to England, or whatever. or come here, and be protected. And with countries that were competing with France. You see what I mean? You didn't have such competition in China. So you see, what's very interesting is that the work of Joel Mokyr, which we talk a lot and we confront with other explanations for the takeoff, if you put that together, it parallels the Schumpeterian paradigm that we have here, you see? And sheds light why is it the takeoff took place in Europe in 1820 and not in China long before 1820. Another enigma is the secular stagnation. Why is it an enigma? If you look at the average annual productivity growth, TFP growth, here I look, you see that in US, but it's true also in most developed countries, it has declined a lot. In fact, the governor, you refer to that, no? To the secular stagnation. After a period of boosts of growth between 1995 and 2005, average annual TFP growth in the US goes down substantially since the early 2000s, despite the IT revolution and despite the artificial intelligence revolution. How come? And so in chapter 6 of the book, we confront various explanations. Ideas harder to get. We don't measure productivity growth properly. There is truth to both. Actually, we don't. We underestimate. You might know that. By the way, you are governor of the central bank. You know that inflation is overestimated by 0.7%, and real productivity growth is underestimated by 0.7%. So you may always tell your colleagues, look, inflation is always 0.7 below what you think it is. I mean, it's important these days now, because we overestimate inflation, we underestimate productivity growth. It's truly, I mean, this is serious. I mean, so we should talk about that. It's not nothing, 0.7. We have dinner together. We will tell you why. Okay? Okay. Very good. Because, in fact, we don't know how to measure creative destruction. In fact, that's the reason. So because we don't know how to measure creative destruction, permanently, we overestimate inflation and we underestimate real productivity growth. I'll tell you, maybe there is a question at the debate. I will explain to you why. And it's directly linked to the fact that we don't measure creative destruction properly. But that's not the reason for the decline, because we always underestimate true productivity growth. We always overestimate inflation. So that does not explain the decline. The most plausible story for the decline in the US is that during the IT revolution, you had the emergence of superstar firms. Google, Amazon, Walmart. Those firms took advantage of the IT revolution. When they spread through the US economy, it boosted growth. That's the boost of growth you have. But then when they invaded all sectors of the US economy, they discouraged innovation by non-superstar firms. That's very much the Schumpeter fear. They were the big innovators, and they end up discouraging innovation by the others. Okay? And you can see that, because first the up and down in growth is mainly in IT-producing sectors, the black curve, and mainly in IT-using sector, which is the gray curve. And the important thing is that if you look at the entry of new firms, since the early 2000s, the entry rate has been going down. So it's truly a discouragement of new firms. And in fact, that's where it's a pity that Mrs. Vestager is not here today, but I've talked to her, and I like her very much. There is a problem with competition policy. It's true in the US, it's true also a bit in Europe. We were doing competition policy very much emphasizing market share, market definition. Not so much does a merger discourage future entry, future innovation. So we let these superstar firms, Amazon, Walmart, to expand through merger and acquisition without never asking whether this merger would discourage subsequent entry, because we're only looking at market share, market definition. I can tell you more about that. Siemens, Alstom, it was very much a case decided based on market share, market definition, not on the fact that it prevents future innovation. So the thing is that if you reform competition policy in the US, you can revert this negative trend of productivity growth, you see? So the problem of growth in the US is that, you had the IT and AI revolution, but institutions did not properly adapt to the revolutions. We did not adapt competition policy to the digital era. You see, you have to do competition policy differently. And that's why the Biden administration did sweeping reforms of competition policy last year in the US. And here in Europe, we also need to modernize the practice of competition policy. But you see, I believe very much, and that's where we are different from Schumpeter or even Robert Gordon, although Robert Gordon now is very much on this line, he likes what we do, is that, you know, they were deeply pessimistic. They thought that secular stagnation was, unavoidable. Schumpeter also thought that, you know, it would be unavoidable. And we say here, no, we are Gramscian optimists. You could reform competition policy. You could do things that, you know, limits the power of the superstar firms and thereby, boosts innovation and innovation-led growth again. You see where we stand compared to doesn't mean it will happen, but we at least identify where the problem is. And we know that there are forces in the US. Biden starts reforming this, and that's a good thing. Okay. In fact, that's interesting, by the way. It shows the markup. Markup have, at the same time as growth has gone down, markup have gone up, but not so much because within firms markup have gone up. They have not gone up. It's a composition effect. It's because the high markup firms, which are the superstar firms, have become more hegemonic. And you can see that again here on the markup. It's a falling growth, increasing markup, but the markup goes up not so much because within firm it goes up. No, it goes up because the high markup firms, through merger and acquisition, and through inappropriate competition policy, are able to expand. Okay, so when you understand that, you say, oh, wait, there is something we can do there. Okay? Okay, now I talk about another one, another enigma, which is middle income trap. So the most interesting is Korea. Korea, if you look after World War II, you see that growth goes up a lot. Particularly here is the average yearly per capita GDP growth rate. It's very high already there during between 60 and 80. It goes even further up between 1980 and 1990. Okay, so South Korea, North Korea, of course, it's South Korea, of course, needless to say. But you can see that then the growth starts declining. Why is that? And so with Acemoglu and Zilibotti, you know, we had this theory, and that's really at the heart of chapter 7 of the book. We say, well, there are several ways to generate productivity growth. Either you can imitate the frontier productivity, and that's catching up growth, or you can innovate upon yourself. You go from A to gamma A, where gamma is greater than 1. It's the only equation I will show in this whole lecture, okay? So you have these two ways. If you are a country very much below the technological frontier, like China used to be in 78, mainly it's through this that you will grow. If you are a country already at the frontier, like Austria is, like a European country, Western Europe, you will mainly grow through this. But the institutions that are good for this are not the same one, are the ones that are good for frontier innovation. If you are in the business of catching up, have good openness of trade, good basic education, that's good, that's okay. You see what I mean? You don't need to have competition, for example. That's not a big deal. Labor market flexibility is not hugely indispensable, you see? But if you're in the business of frontier innovation, then creative destruction is very important. You need flexibility, you need entry and exit, you need competition, you need labor market flexibility. That becomes much more. You need good graduate schools. If you're in the business of imitation, good primary, secondary, and undergrad is enough, you see? Finance, if you're in the business of imitation and catching up, bank finance is essentially okay. If you're in the business of frontier innovation, you need private equity, you need venture capital, you need business angels and all that, okay? Now, the thing, and you can see that you saw my work on competition with Blondel, okay? We know that, you know, you are a classroom, okay? You are all very good, equally good. But suppose, in fact, some of you are better. Okay, the governor and the first row are better than the rest, okay? Okay. Or maybe, I don't know, you are very good. And suppose now I open the door and I let a very good student come in. What will happen? Then all of you will work harder to remain the first of the class. The bottom of the class, already discouraged, will be even more discouraged when I let the new student in. It's the same for firms. The blue firms are the firms that are close to the technological frontier in their sector. The orange firms are the firms that are far below the technological frontier in their sector. The blue firms, they react positively. The growth and innovation in those firms react positively to competition, to an increase in competition. Whereas for firms that are far below, it reacts negatively. Now, the more developed a country is, the more blue firms it has compared to orange firms. So you can see right away that the more developed you are, the more growth enhancing it is to have more competition. You see, it's very important when you are a frontier country close to the world frontier, which means that you have mainly blue firms. It's so important to have competition. When you are a catching up country, it's not dramatic if you don't have much competition, okay? Now the problem, well, how do we explain the middle income trap? We explain the middle income trap because during the catching up phase, Korea developed some conglomerates. Again, you go back to Schumpeter. And the conglomerates in Korea are called the chaebols. Is everybody from Korea here? Because they will tell me my pronunciation is even worse than my English pronunciation, okay? In Korean. Yeah. My Korean is approximative. Yeah. So it's called the chaebols, okay? And these chaebols, not only they discourage entry, but they discourage government to implement more competition policy. You see what I mean? So, in fact, what happened is that that's why growth in Korea started going down after the 90s. Because these chaebols, they prevented the necessary transition from policies that were good for catching up growth to policies like competition that were good for frontier innovation-based growth, okay? But then, you see, the thing happened is that if you detail the post-1990, in Korea, they had a financial crisis in the late 90s. You remember, Governor, the financial crisis of the late 90s? You remember? I was there. You were there? Okay. Alors, you know now, you could say it was only a bad thing. No, it was a good thing. Why was it also a good thing? Because it weakened the power of the chaebols, and therefore more entry came. I did the work with Gureyev, you know Sergei. More entry came. And also, it forced the government of Korea to implement more competition policy, the IMF program. And here the effect grows, at least for a while, goes up, before again going down. But it's interesting that a crisis can at least temporarily help you, because by weakening the power of the conglomerates, at least temporarily, it unleashed innovation forces, and it allowed the government to implement more pro-competition policy. So it's very interesting, this middle income trap. But again, you see, Schumpeter will tell you that it's a lost case. I will tell you no. There are forces that can be activated to prevent. Japan is another case of middle income trap, although Japan is not middle income. The syndrome is the same. Up to the late 80s, Japan grows very fast, and then Japan stops growing because you have a conglomerate in Japan called the Keiretsus. Anybody from Japan? Nobody. Bon. The Keiretsus did exactly like the chaebols. They, I know that they are very strong because I know through Carlos Ghosn. I mean, I don't want to defend Carlos Ghosn, but when he was in Japan, the collusion between the big enterprise and the state was obvious. But I don't, of course, take a position on Carlos Ghosn. So that's interesting, and that's now why Japan is growing so slow. It's an aging population, but also with this all-powerful conglomerates. And so that's the second enigma, and that's very much, but you can have forces that may counteract their power. And that's where, you know, France a bit was subject to that. We had les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years between 45 to 75. And we had institutions that were very good for catching up, but not much competition, not much labor market flexibility. That's what Macron tried to do, to implement, you know, more labor market flexibility in these reforms. It was a tough policy, and now it will be even tougher for him. I don't want to enter in French politics, but that's France had the same syndrome. The Attali Commission, where I met Macron, was all about moving from institutions that were good for the 30 Glorious into institutions that are good for innovation-based policy. That I met Macron, he was a student, he came to my home. I taught him economics, he taught me philosophy. Okay, so now another enigma is sources and dynamics of inequality. We know there's been the work of Piketty, Saez, Atkinson. explaining that in the US, but in most developed economies, the share of income of the top 1% income earners have gone up sharply since the 1980s. You see, that's this curve, okay? And the question is why it has gone like that. And so there is one measure of inequality, which is the share of income of the top 1% income earners. But that might not be the only measure of inequality. Another measure can be the global inequality, the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure, I don't want to go into details here, of how far away we are from perfect equality. If we are at perfect equality, Gini is 0. If nobody earns anything, but only the richest earn everything, the Gini is 1, okay? So Gini is a measure of global measure of inequality. The share of income of the top 1% is a very local measure. It's only the top income. And there is a third measure of inequality, which is a dynamic inequality, the extent to which children's income is correlated with parental income. That's a dynamic measure of inequality. It's lack of social mobility. It turns out that's what we call the Great Gatsby curve. In places where you have more social mobility, where you have less, correlation between parents and children, and we're on the verge of a big accident, usually you have less global inequality. Okay, so whenever you have more social mobility, you tend to have less global inequality. But what's interesting, there is no evident link between social mobility and the share of income of the top 1%. For example, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and California are places where you have both more social mobility than elsewhere in the US, but also a higher fraction of income for the top 1%. Why? Because those are innovating places, and innovation gives rents of innovation. So that's what triggered this thing, encourages me with Blondel, Bergeau, Emus, Axigit, to explore the link between innovation and top income inequality. Innovation is one source of top income inequality, but lobbying and entry barriers are another source. I always say there is Steve Jobs and Carlos Slim. Steve Jobs is a guy who becomes rich because he creates Apple. Mr. Skype is one of the richest men in Sweden. Nobody from Sweden here? Because he created Skype, okay? But Carlos Slim is a rich Mexican. Nobody from Mexico there? No. Carlos Slim is a rich person in Mexico who is particularly rich since he's at the head of an unregulated monopoly in telecoms of Mexico. That's another way to be rich, okay? So, and that's my big debate with Piketty. In the world of Piketty, there are only Carlos Slims. But I say, no, Thomas, there are Carlos Slims, but there are also Steve Jobs. And you have to have both in your world. You cannot just have only one. You miss something. Why is it important? Innovation is a source of top income inequality. I will show that to you. It's a good source because innovations gives you growth. Innovations, it's true that it increases top income inequality, but as I will show you in a moment, it also increases social mobility. Why? Because of creative destruction. Creative destruction means that the new replaces the old. That's a force of social mobility. Mr. Skype was nobody before doing Skype. And through Skype, he became rich. But of course, he replaced other people who fell down. That's a source of social mobility. And I will show you also that innovating firms create more good jobs. It's a force of social mobility innovation. But because it increases top income inequality, but also social mobility, innovation does not increase broad inequality. That's a very interesting finding, unlike lobbying and entry barriers. So it's a good source, innovation. I tell Thomas, if you overtax, you will discourage innovation. And that not only will be bad for growth, but it will also be bad for social mobility. You will shoot yourself in the feet. So be careful. You not only have Carlos Slims around, you have Steve Jobs. You don't want to discourage them, okay? So that's what we showed here. It's in chapter 5 of the book. And it's based with the work with Axigit, Bergeau, Blondel, and Emus. We looked at US states, and we rank US states by the intensity of innovation measured by the amount of patenting. Okay? So we have, and the same state might be here or here from one year to another. So the more you go to the right, the more innovative a US state is in a given year. And on the vertical axis is the measure of inequality. The continuous line is the share of income of the top 1%. The dotted line is the Gini in that state in that year. You see that there is a clear positive relationship between innovation intensity and the share of income of the top 1%. More innovation, and we show it's causal. We have an instrumentation strategy. More innovation causes more top income inequality. That's true. But on the other hand, you see that more innovation does not increase global inequality. Why is that? Because more innovation is associated with more social mobility. If I put a straight line here, it's clearly an upward sloping line. In places where you have more innovation, there is less correlation between parents' income and children's income. And in fact, we can show here as well, I look here at the wage over time of a non-skilled worker. In the continuous line, it's a worker in an innovating firm. The dotted line is a worker working in a non-innovating firm. You can see that at any age, you earn more if you work in an innovating firm. But also you see that your wage profile over time grows further in an innovating firm than in a non-innovating firm. Because the innovating firm, they need reliable. They need to reward soft skills. They need to reward ability to interact with other people in the firm. They need to reward trustworthiness. Those are soft skills. They are worth much more in an innovating firm than non-innovating. And they reward those. They create what we call good jobs, and they train their workers to acquire those soft skills. And that's why they give better career prospects to them. So innovation is good. Innovation gives you growth, gives you social mobility. It's true that it increases top income inequality, but it does not increase global inequality. So you don't want to discourage innovation. Piketty doesn't care about innovation. It doesn't exist for him. He doesn't care. He believes it doesn't exist. Okay. Now, lobbying, it has everything wrong, because lobbying, you lobby to put entry barriers. You are an existing firm. You do lobbying mostly to prevent new entrants. That will reduce growth because it will prevent innovation. Because it reduces entry, it will reduce social mobility. And therefore, not only it increases top income inequality, but it also increases broad inequality. That's lobbying, it's Carlos Slim. Innovation is Steve Jobs. And you can see that. That's the link between US state in state, US state that lobby more, top income inequality tends to be higher, but also the Gini, especially in those places that lobby more, you see that the Gini also goes up. You see, so that's the thing. So the thing is that you want to distinguish from the rents due to innovation and the rents due to lobbying. But even for rents due to innovation, you want to make sure they will not be used ex post to prevent subsequent innovation. But that you do not only through tax policy, you do that through competition policy and through rules to finance political campaigns. In the US, this wonderful Supreme Court, which distinguished itself last week by, the beautiful legislation on weapons and the beautiful legislation on abortion. Before that, in an equally beautiful legislation, allowing firms to subsidize political campaigns without any limit. That's terrible because you give power to incumbents, of course, to lobby and prevent new entry. Those are the kind of thing you don't want. So you see, to fight, to make sure that rents will not be used ex post, you have the tax policy, yes, of course, but you have competition policy and rules to finance political campaign and the anti-lobbying, also what you can do to limit the bad lobbying. And all those policies are complementary. In the world of my friend, only tax policy. He's obsessed by taxation. For him, competition policy, the other tools don't exist. And I think if you want to look at inequality, you have to look at inequality first, the source of inequality, realize that excessive taxation will kill innovation and therefore will reduce social mobility and growth. So you should tax, of course, but you should tax reasonably and like we do in our countries, you see what I mean? And it's not because you put a 100% tax rate that you solve the problem. Of course, you should not put zero tax rate. You need taxation to finance education, health, employment policies, and all that. But, you have to be reasonable in the taxation, especially because you have other instruments to complement, to induce more social mobility. Okay? And I will get back to that later. But that's the way we look at inequality. So I'm done with the first part of are you still alive? Are you still alive? Wow, you are amazing. You are amazingly resistant. But now it becomes easier. We've done the hardest part of the book, okay? Now we come to the easy stuff. Now, the second thing that the book does is to question some common wisdoms. How long do I have left? 15 minutes? Oh my God, I should speed up a bit. Okay, I will tell you only 2 examples, okay? I will pass the second one. There are wrong common wisdom. Some of my friends make very stupid recommendations of a very baby to governments. So we had, political campaigns in France are periods where, you can see the very most curious ideas. One of them is tax robots to protect employment. You see, what's very interesting is that, of course, robots tend to replace manpower. So a very simplistic view would be to say, tax the robots and you protect employment. But life is more complicated. Because in France, that's work I did with the same co-authors as the book, Antonin, Bunel. Antonin, her dream is to come to work in Austria. And Xavier Jaravel, with my colleague at the LSE. And we look at various measures of automation. And we showed firm-level panel that firms in France that automate, they create employment. You will ask me, how come robots replace manpower? How come you create employment by automating? But in fact, it's because firms that create employment, that's various measures of automation. First one is modern industrial equipment, a measure from Acemoglu Restrepo, that's the pure robots. Voilà. Whether you use, why is that? It's because when you automate, you become more productive. Because you become more productive, you can lower your price. Because you can lower your price, you increase your market share worldwide, your market size. Therefore, you increase the world demand for your products, and therefore you employ more. If I put tax on robots and automation, I will prevent firms from becoming more productive. And of course, there is business stealing of others elsewhere, but that's the name of the game. Okay, but at least you will encourage firms. There's been work relatedly by, Dalia Marin. You know Dalia. Isn't Dalia from Austria, Dalia? You know Dalia. She's done work recently showing that firms that automate, they outsource less. You've seen that work, okay? It's in Vox EU. Voilà, same thing. So the productivity effect more than counteracts the substitution effect. By the way, that explains why none of the big industrial revolution, steam engine, electricity, none of them gave rise to the mass unemployment people thought, because the productivity effect more than counteracted the substitution effect. Okay, that's one example, okay? Another one I want to show, I will go directly to the negative growth. You see, in France, I don't know about Austria, there is something very much in fashion called décroissance, degrowth, negative growth. Do you have that also here? Oh, poor you, poor you. Oh, all my condolences, okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, la, 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 la. Let me help you there. Let me help you. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Voilà. Alors, let me tell you about this, how you deal with them, how you deal with them. How you deal with the degrowth. I'll tell you how you do. It's true, historically, they are right. You always have to concede to someone who you don't agree with. So historically, you are totally right. If you look at temperature starts going up exactly at the time of the industrial takeoff. So historically, yes, growth is responsible for the takeoff of temperature. Historically, they are right. So first concede that to them. Say, you're right. If hadn't we have the Industrial Revolution, temperature would be there and it's there, okay? That's the counterfactual. Totally right. Okay, so what, okay? Should we go back to pre-1820? Where life expectancy was very low, where, we had terrible sewage systems, terrible hygiene, etc. We had a natural, then you start talking to them. Say, look, whatever. We had a natural experiment of negative growth. It was the first lockdown. You remember the first lockdown? 2020, we had no choice. We didn't have the vaccine at the time. We had a natural experiment. The French economy, GDP went down by 35% between March and May, June 2020. I don't know about Austria, might have been similar, no? CO2 emissions went down by 8%. So, okay, it means if you want to only fight climate change through negative growth, we should be permanently on the first lockdown. But we had to do it, but it had terrible side effects on the youth in particular. The young went crazy. The number of young people under psychiatric help in France has plummeted. I don't know about here, you see? So that's what you want? That's the society that you want? Okay? Me, I tell you another thing. Is green innovation. I said, growth is not growth of quantity, it's growth of utils. And through innovation, we have the growth in utils. I give you the choice. Go to a dentist of the 1950s or go to a dentist. So I remember the dentist of the early 60s. It was endless drilling. I don't remember. Oh, it was awful. You are too young to know that. It was awful to go to a dentist. Now it's nothing. 2 seconds. They give you the anesthetic. You don't feel anything. Me, I tell a degrowth, I bring you right away to a dentist of the 1950s. I convert the person into a pro-growth right away. I think that's the radical way. You should not discuss. Go directly, dentist 1960s, and then you converted the person to, not the marathon man, but the, voilà. Okay, so if you look here, for example, China and India, CO2 emissions, of course, go up because they have growth. But the way out, it's green innovation. There is the only way. So innovation to find new sources of energy, innovation to learn how to save on inexhaustible resources, innovation to change ways of producing, and innovation to behave differently. It's also innovation in our way of being. But the only way is innovation. And that's where I show you here green in automotive industry, green and polluting innovation. In fact, what's the good news is that if you look, there is catching up in automotive industry. Clean innovation has caught up with dirty. Okay, that's good news. Okay. Now the problem with innovation, it's spontaneously firms that innovated in dirty technologies in the past. They won't spontaneously innovate in clean technologies today because you keep doing what you are good at. So first, that means that creative destruction will help you because new firms, they didn't have a past. This past dependence effect do not apply to new firms. So already creative destruction is your friend in fighting climate change because new firms, they are not subject to the bad habits problem, okay? Then the problem is how does the state redirect existing firms' innovation toward green? Well, you have several instruments. You have the carbon price, the carbon tax, of course. That's important. Although in France we tried 3 years ago and we got the yellow vest, okay? So you have to do it more smartly than we did in France to learn from the French stupidities 3 years ago, okay? So do it but smart, quoi. That's certainly, of course, an instrument. But the other one is green innovation, subsidies to green innovation. And in the smart industrial policy. We got the vaccine because of BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. We should have the same for green innovation, okay? So that's, I think, so that's important. And what we explain in chapter 9 is that the state, through those things, can direct innovation towards green, but the civil society, consumers, when they are pro-environment, they push firms to innovate greener, particularly in more competitive environment. So it's very interesting that the triangle firms, the state, and civil society. This triangle is crucial. So I arrive now to the last part of the talk on COVID, rethinking capitalism. The COVID crisis revealed two pitfalls of capitalism that are different in the US, across the Atlantic. Essentially, in the US, it showed a broken social model. And in Europe, it showed an inadequate innovation ecosystem. Here I show you the gray curves are US, the black curves are Germany. But I'm sure Austria would be like Germany, okay? And this is the share of population without, that are unemployed. It goes up a lot in the US during the COVID. When you lose your employment in the US, you have a probability of using health insurance. So this is the fraction of US citizens without health insurance. It goes down with Obamacare. You see the beauty of Obamacare, and goes up again during COVID. Look at Germany. Everybody has health insurance, like in Austria. Austria and Germany is the same. We are much better, okay? Oh, you are much better. Okay, say share of people at the verge of poverty. When you lose your employment in the US, you are more likely to fall into poverty. But in Germany, no. In Germany, it's constant. In Austria, in France, would be constant. So that's it. The other thing is the death of despair. That's the mortality of middle-aged, unskilled 50-54 aged Americans. Went up a lot. That's Deaton and Case that's showing that. And why? Because of the death of despair, they call it. When the fear of unemployment, because you lose health insurance, you become poor, you become stressed, your family dislocates, you start taking opioids, sleeping pills, and, eating pizzas too much, and you know, pizza is good, but not too much, and you die, okay? And not in Denmark, not in Austria, not in our countries, okay? So on the social ground, the model is not good in the US, okay? But on the other hand, on innovation, that we talk in chapter 11 of the book. In chapter 12 of the book, we talk about innovation. When you talk about innovation, that's the number of triadic patents per million inhabitants yearly, okay? And you see that the US is well above us, is well above everybody. Triadic are patents that are registered US, Japan, and Europe. Patent office, well above us. Okay, biotech, and in all things, number of top-cited patents, US above everybody. You can see. But if you look at biotech patents per million inhabitants, US above everybody. So why is that? Because they have a fantastic ecosystem of innovation, very well-funded public research. National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, Howard Hughes Medical Investigator, which is a private donors organization to finance basic research in bio. Fantastic ecosystem. Then they have venture capital, very well developed, business angels, institutional investors, and they have the DARPA and the BARDA. You know, in things like space and defense or energy or vaccines, they have this very smart way to put government money and then elicit competing projects with government money, like they did with the vaccine. We are all here thanks to that. Okay, so that we don't have that in Europe. BARDA alone, they spent, you know, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority spent $12 billion on the vaccine, you know, for the COVID vaccine. Europe total, EIB and European Commission, we spent total $4 million, and not through a BARDA type. So they are well above. So now the challenge, and I have 2 minutes left. The big challenge of capitalism, we would like the best of both worlds. I would like to be as innovative as the US and as protective and inclusive as Europe. Then I like Denmark very much, and you know, but some people believe that it's either or. If you choose to be more innovative, it has to be at the expense of inclusive and protective. If you choose to be protective, it has to be at the expense of being more. I disagree with that. And I know there are some of my colleagues who argue that, and I don't agree with them. There are 3 types of policies that are good, that make you both more innovative and more protective and inclusive. Flex security on the labor market, that's the Danish system, education, competition. Give me 3 minutes, okay? I told you already about, you know, the death of despair increasing in the US. In Denmark, the work of Alexandra Roulet, my colleague, she looked at the health of a worker in Denmark whose plants closes down, with the health of an identical worker in experience, age, education, in a plant that does not, and type of work, in a place that does not close down. No effect of being unemployed on the purchase of antidepressants and anti-anxiety in Denmark. No effect on the probability of visiting a hospital for circulatory problems. No effect on mortality. Why? Because they have the flex security system. When you lose your job in Denmark, for 3 years, you get up to 90% of the salary, okay? And the state helps you retrain and find a new job. If you refuse more than 2 jobs, you get the unemployment subsidy goes down. It's a fantastic system. It made creative destruction works very well and protects people, as we can see here. So that's a policy which is both makes you more innovative and more protective. The other one is education. I just want to show you that. This is the probability of inventing in the US as a function of parental income. If your parents' income is in the highest centile of the income distribution, you are much more likely to invent, to become an innovator if you are in the lower, if your parents are in the lower income brackets. That's US current data. That's US historical data. That's Finland. Alors that's very surprising. How come also in Finland you are more likely to invent if you have high income parent? In Finland, you have school is free and high quality. How come is like that? Alors we looked into the Finnish with my colleagues Toivainen and Aitinen. In fact, that's a paper that we started here in Austria. You remember the conference that you organized? We got the idea exactly at that conference. That's a paper that owes to Michael, okay? So all the blame should be on him, okay? So now the thing is that when we control for parental education, this curve goes down. That means that, in fact, it's not so much that the high-earning parents in Finland pay more for the school is free. But they turn out to be the parents who are more educated, and they transmit knowledge and aspiration to their children. Now you might say, but look, is that so important? If you have a very good education system, as they have in Finland, parental education should not matter. The problem is that they had their reform in 1970. It's then that they had a broad-based, high-quality system. If you restrict attention to researchers in Finland who went through education after 1970, the J-curve completely disappears. There is no more dependence between parental income and education and the children. What does it mean? It means in our societies, we have a lot of lost Einsteins, very smart children, but they are born to parents who don't have the knowledge and aspiration. If we had an education system more like Finland, I'm done in 2 minutes, we would have many less lost Einsteins. It would make our economy more innovative, but also more inclusive. And the last one is competition. You remember I told you that you had a decline in productivity growth in the US because of lack of competition. Suppose now you reform competition policy. It will increase innovation-based growth, more innovation by entrants, but it makes growth more inclusive because we saw that innovation by entrants boosts social mobility. Okay, so you do that, you will both boost growth and boost social mobility. So you see, you can make the economy more innovative, more like the US, and even more inclusive that we have now through policies of that type. But the key to that is the triangle between firms, state, and civil society. Remember, I started, it's my last slide. I told you Schumpeter was very worried that the first innovators would be entrenched conglomerates that would prevent subsequent innovation. But then you could say, well, the state could have competition policy. Now you could say, well, the state, we know in Korea, can be bought by the firms. Now you could say Montesquieu could help you with the separation of power. But you know, Colombia has the same constitution as France. But if you are a union leader in Colombia, you might be killed tomorrow. Not in France for the moment. Nobody from Colombia? No. Bon, alors, okay, but the key is civil society. Civil society makes sure that the constitution, which is an incomplete social contract, is implemented. That's why you need this triangle, like I did for the green innovation. Firms innovate, the state has instruments, but civil society is there to make sure that the state is not being bought out by firms and does its job to make creative destruction sustain and to direct it towards greener and more inclusive growth. So I think I stop there, and that's my response to Schumpeter's pessimism, is a triangle. Thank you very much.
So, I don't think I overpromised. Come and sit down. Now we're going to tear your arguments apart. In the middle, yeah.
In the middle.
And to tear your arguments apart, I invite some panelists up here.
Excellent.
Professor Schmidt-Dengler, Dr. Birgit Niessner, and Karl Aiginger, also professor. I think the modus of this panel discussion will be, I give them 5 minutes to respond to the incredible richness of argumentation and the speech which was given. And they can choose what they want to respond to, yeah? Or which part of the oeuvre of Philippe they want to react to. I think I will go afterwards, since we are moving on in time. I'll take some questions and comments from the audience afterwards, and then we'll see whether we have some further rounds, and Philippe will get the last word. So let's start with Philippe, another Philippe.
It's 6 a.m., so we have time.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the talk also. I must say I very much enjoyed reading the book, but it's not quite as entertaining as the presentation, so it was really a very lively and excellent talk. What I particularly like about the book is that it sticks to what is good practice in academic economics, that it's targeted to our general audience, but nevertheless it relies on the discipline of models. And discusses and describes verbally the mechanism of these models, and then confronts it with the data, and in the end tells us the lessons that we can learn. So what I want to do here is maybe talk a little bit of what I thought we could learn here in Austria from reading this excellent book. The book talks a lot about growth, and it's primarily Schumpeterian growth, right? So new ideas, innovation, new technologies replacing old technologies. And you rightly dismiss degrowth as a solution, but currently we're actually experiencing degrowth, not just because of the lockdown, but also negative, let's say, solo-type growth, in a sense that, sadly, human capital is being destroyed, physical capital is being destroyed. We may even be experiencing negative Schumpeterian growth because it looks like we're firing up coal plants and at the same time shutting down nuclear power plants. And also negative Smithian growth because there is less trade, one because of supply chain disruptions and sanctions due to the war. And there's a new fad which is called resilience, which many people interpret as we should be producing more at home than we used to do abroad. So we have very good experience with that with our masks. We all thought we were wearing masks produced in Austria, but it turns out that they were actually produced in China, and they just put a stamp on which said Austria. So being the first here to comment, I'm actually wondering whether, or it's a question to Philippe, can Schumpeterian growth actually compensate for this negative growth that we're experiencing? In part in the book, he also writes that trade often, so Smithian growth, right, the initiation of trade also initiates Schumpeterian growth by the destination countries starting to cite the patents of the importing firms. Another big theme in the book is competition, and what we learn is that at the frontier, in particular, entry barriers and lobbyism stifle innovation. So we think of ourselves here in Austria at the frontier, and I think we're certainly at the frontier when it comes to lobbyism and entry barriers. And part of this is the cooperative structure, or what we call social partnership. And this probably served us very well when we were in the catch-up phase, but now is becoming a problem. Part of this is mirrored when we look at the competition authority, which should be strong, but ends up actually being poorly financed compared to other countries of similar size, for instance. It's not independent when it comes to personal matters, to financial matters. The minister can meddle basically at any time. It has an advisory board or even maybe supervisory board, which the members of are members of the employee and employer trade associations. Those are representatives of the incumbents. They're not representatives of the entrants, the ones that are the ones that innovate, as the book explains. I think we also experience a very negative view on competition in general in this country. So, for instance, I think competition in the retail financial sector is dismal. When I once complained to somebody working in the supervision of the financial sector that, for instance, fees in retail finance were terrible, I was told, well, competition would be very bad because then they would spend a lot of money on advertising. I wouldn't mind if they spent some money on advertising their low fees, but they don't have to. Yeah, it's not getting better. The recent amendment to the competition law, which was supposed to strengthen the competition authority, actually allows the minister to inquire at any point, so basically keeping the competition authority from working. And what is probably also troubling is that anti-competitive behavior, what is considered anti-competitive behavior, can be legal once it helps with the green transition, which is, of course, something very vague. So we have backdoor legalization of anti-competitive behavior. The last thing I want to say is also what Philippe said in the end is what is crucial for innovation and growth is the equal access to education. And in particular, therefore, so equal and widespread access, and therefore, the chance to become innovators. We know in Austria, education is still largely inherited, again, more so than in many other comparable countries. This is due to early tracking. We still separate kids at the age of 10 into an academic and non-academic track. We isolate migrants into German classes instead of truly integrating them. I think it's time to change these things, and I hope many people read the book, and maybe some people in charge change their mind, because otherwise we're missing out on a lot of innovators. Thank you.
Thank you, Philipp. Birgit.
Thank you. The last time I heard you was in 2014 in Luxembourg, and it has not become less exciting.
Where was this?
Luxembourg, and it has
Yes, I
not
remember.
it has not become less exciting to listen to you. But I'm really glad that you're sitting now because you made me very nervous.
Oh, yeah, we're at the verge of a disaster there, absolutely.
And also, your book is a wonderful read. I must say that I highly appreciate the positive tone and the wide range and strands of economics you cover. So I have a background in development economics, but I worked in financial industry, and I can relate to many things you say. I highly appreciate your ability to go beyond mainstream debates, which very often have the characteristic of either or. Yeah? And let me quote probably my favorite sentence out of the book, which is, capitalism is a spirited horse. So it has a wonderful force and power, but you have to hold the reins firmly. And that's exactly what you do. You don't talk about bad or good capitalism, but you fight for a better capitalism. And a similar discussion, a very nuanced debate is yours on inequality, where you show that, Carlos Slim, Steve Jobs. But let me quote another example from the book, which I really like. In Sweden, they cut the income and the capital income tax. As a result, they harvested more productivity and innovation, but the Gini and the poverty rate barely moved. Yeah? So it's this top income segment which contributed to innovation. So it's really something which you must show to us, to the Americans, and it's very comforting that you believe in and you testify strongly the case of both. You can have both. Yeah, flexicurity, you can have social protection, and you can have innovation. But, and I'm coming a little bit to what you also said, is I would like to raise two issues which came along with the next crisis we are facing, because your book was not able to cover the next black swan event which we are facing. And this time, and maybe that's why I liked your positive book, but this time I really have the feeling this crisis may be too much for us. So never waste a good crisis. But what we are seeing in the energy sector is really that we are having probably, I don't know how this will develop, but if the Austrian industry loses the access to cheap gas, we will have an uncontrolled big process of destruction, and I doubt very much whether this will be creative destruction, and we really see backward substitution towards coal, as was already mentioned. So this is something where I have the feeling that this may be an overwhelming crisis, which we will not be able to use to our own benefit. And the other thing where I would be interested, or let me raise two other topics. One was already raised by the governor, who showed the malign relationship which monetary policy and productivity growth can have. But what would you expect from which would be the right monetary policy to enhance creative destruction? And my last issue, which I would like to raise, is now after COVID and due to the war, we talk about a lot of the reshaping of value chains. And there is this word of friend-shoring. So you choose your partners according to geopolitical preferences, or those where you still have access. But I know that what you think about protectionism, but is this something similar, which also may turn against our endeavor to have more productive societies and economies? Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. Karl.
So, my start is with Karl Marx and with Joseph Schumpeter. You cite Karl Marx in your book as philosophers interpret the world, but the point is to change the world, said Karl Marx. What I estimate, and Schumpeter's message is disruptions can be positive. And to both points, I want to say change, however positive, however possible, has to go in the right direction. And that is important. There is no undirected change which makes everything better, but we have to see for the right direction. If the United States, China, Germany Sweden, Finland, France decide about where the world should go. There are very different directions in which they would like us to go. How green, how social, how global, protectionism as you said it, should the world become. I give here 3 inputs of my own research. The first, there are a lot of changes which are needed just now. Climate change has not been mentioned as often as it is. We became a very, very hot climate, and we say in these days in the cool Vienna that it can be very, very warm. We have the health problem, we have the peace problem, the war which had we thought was pushed out of Europe is now 600, 700 kilometers east of Vienna. And we have a new form of populism, and we have still persistent racial discrimination and inequality, not so much in Europe, but in the United States. And so this is a lot with the diffusion of green innovation. We have better technologies, much better technologies, but somebody is preventing to use them. If you see we have a problem with gas shortage, yes, we have a problem, but mainly because we did so many errors in the past. We didn't know how much gas we imported from the United States. We didn't know that our largest faculty to store this is owned by the Russians, and that's not a good policy which we should follow. We have to move from the laissez-faire capitalism to a form in which the state and the civil society plays their full role. Sweden, as Birgit said, had a welfare reform that reduced taxes very much and made the economy more innovative at the same time. Sweden said we will reduce taxes, but with the goal to make Sweden a leader in the innovation. And Sweden has now one of the largest R&D ratios only to allow one measures. Obamacare got the uninsured into the insured sector, but racial problems and injustice through policies and gun power remained. So we have reforms, yes, but we have a dumb state in most countries who is going in the wrong direction. And then it doesn't help if the government share or the share of taxes in GDP is rising in the direction of 50% if that is done in the wrong direction. So European countries, also part in the sentence book, suffer from a different evil. It failed to create an ecosystem. Universities, institutional investors, and venture capitalists, DABA, which enabled Europe to become a leader instead of a follower. Summarizing, capitalism is a spirited horse. I like this very much, but it takes off and escapes control if we don't try to direct it in the direction we want. We have to direct progress and change. Innovation, and here we are with productivity, should not only labor saving, but much more resource saving and energy. We can have the same productivity rate increase with less energy, less gas, and less resources are needed. And Europe can take here more responsibility for its citizens and for its neighbors. Second point, we need creative destruction. Creative destructions increases employment and life chances. Safety nets are necessary to prevent anxiety and populism. Populism was one of the problems I had to study 1 or 2 years ago, and it didn't know where it came from. It's very interesting to say where it came from, but there's no time now. Innovation needs democracy and goals. What is beneficial for society and what is not. Summarizing the second point, innovation is not spontaneous environmental friendly. It needs intervention. Productivity is good, but labor productivity less than resource productivity and energy productivity. Yes, my third, can make it shorter. My most important contribution is there are many variants of capitalism and of democracy in the United States, in Europe, in China. The big brother often is dumb in the sense that it pays subsidies in the wrong direction. We have much more subsidies for fossil energy in Europe and in most other countries in the world than for non-fossil energy. We proclaim an end of coal, but if gas is missing, let us activate our fossil plants. Productivity results from innovation, but innovation can go in many directions. China and Africa will decide more than we are thinking today. It may be good if they change too, but they have to forgive the former colonialists which let them down. Wars will not stop, but if the danger of wars has to be reduced, this will happen not by more weapons and more armament, but by bottom-up and democracy. So the end, we are on the way to a new world order in or after a phase of creative destruction. Europe has the best model to lead, I believe. I'm very optimistic about Europe. If we take all the problems we have and all the things we can achieve, it can be better. Yes, but only if European countries cooperate with neighbors and with the EU, and the EU more with its citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karl. Let me take some questions or comments from the audience. There's one at the very end. There's here, well, quite a lot. Probably we go first to this side. There are 1, 2, 3.
So may we start with the questions?
Where's the microphone?
Here is.
Okay, yes, you can start. Yeah.
Thank you. So a question to Philippe. You were very optimistic by having like a loophole called civil society. Let me bring John Nash to the game, who would say we have a lot of coordination failures, and this is inherent to our human nature, right? We disagree on things, it's very hard to sustain, and it's usually harder for many people to coordinate resources for sustained activity. This is what corporations are much better at because they act as hierarchies. So what is your question? What is your answer to John Nash in that respect? Thank you.
Okay, there was a question here. No, let me take a few here. Here, in front. I'll take 3 and then...
So, thank you very much. Just a few questions and remarks on what you said. You referred to the need of competition policy, which I fully agree with, but you referred also to superstar firms. And of course, in the concept of the IT revolution, this is an American phenomenon by and large. If I go to the literature, let's say, or the book of Thomas Philippon, he's a bit more optimistic in the sense that competition is more thorough in Europe, even though, I mean, Philipp has just given quite a few examples of culture of embezzlement also in these countries that lead to a downgrading of competition. But still, I would like to have a judgment where the European case is different from the US case. Then another aspect that was mentioned by Birgit Niessner as well is the change in international competition. And here, of course, and that also leads to the emergence of populism and so on. We know that especially the competition with China has led to in some regions and in disadvantaged regions to basically an increase in populism, and also partly due to the case that, or to the fact that there is not really a level playing field in competition. So the question is, how would you design trade policies to deal with autocracies?
Thank you. And the last one on this side is here, yeah. And then we give it to Philipp and we come to the other side.
Yeah, my question is based on data and competition policy. No? Like the next technologies for the next 10 or 15 years are going to be based basically in AI, robotics, additive manufacturing, and all the three aspects are going to be based on data, which is the most important asset for these superstars. No? So how is data and competition policy going together? And your opinions based on this difference between how Europeans and how Americans see data? Thank you.
Philipp. So there were many questions that were asked by the panelists, and so maybe I start with you ask about the war and the gas. I've never been in favor of immediate embargo on gas, personally. I think helping Ukraine to arm, that I completely understand. To speed up energy transition, I completely understand. The idea that we should impose an immediate embargo on gas, although in France we are okay because we have many nuclear plants. We didn't make the same decision as Germany did, which I think was unwise, to decide to close down all nuclear plants right away this year. I think that was not a wise decision. But still, I think that I was not in favor of immediate embargo on gas. I thought there were other ways to help with weapons, helping reconstruct and other things. So on that, and the solution is, of course, energy transition, and try to manage the energy transition with energy sources that you have, and then investing in new sources of energy. And I think that's the best we can do. I don't see any other way. But I was not in favor of adding to the problems we already have. I mean, that was not, I don't think would have helped Ukraine in any way. I think Ukraine mainly would be through weaponry, and then reconstruction, much more than anything else, personally. You ask about Nash. That's what I think was smart with the DARPA. The DARPA is a very smart way of industrial policy because it solves the coordination problem. You have situations where the basic research has been done and you need to turn it into fulfilling technological missions. DARPA was created in the 1950s, because you were racing with the Soviet Union on space and defense, and you had to coordinate actors and resources to fulfill those missions. And that's how they created DARPA. But what's very smart with DARPA is a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. The money comes from the ministry, you have team leaders, and they elicit competing projects, and that's the bottom-up place. Some people believe that whenever you do industrial policy, it should be top-down purely and anti-competitive purely. No, I believe that you can do competition policy smartly, solve the coordination problem partly in areas where you really have a coordination problem, and still elicit markets and competition. You see what I mean? I'm not of the view that it's an either-or. You can totally reconcile the need for coordination with the fact that you have also the market. But that's, again, an instance where state and market both come into play, and they have to find a way to do that smartly. That's what I wanted to say on Nash. I mean, Nash, vertical integration is not the only way to solve Nash. And by the way, you also have free riding within firms. It's not because you have firms that you've solved free riding problems. You have also authority allocation problem within firms. All the work of Oliver Hart and work I've done myself with Tirol and others, we try to deal with that. It's not by a miracle you eliminate coordination problems because it's within a firm rather than between firms. We can talk about that at length. I've done a whole part of my research is on this kind of topic. Competition policy, EU, US. Now, it's true that, I know the work of Thomas. Thomas, we don't disagree much because he also thinks that competition policy in the US is not adequate. In Europe, it's a bit better. But still in Europe, I have an example there, which is Siemens-Alstom. I'm okay. Because you think I'm a French nationalist, and I was not happy. Speaking about Mrs. Vestager, whom I respect infinitely, is not there. I did not quite understand the Siemens-Alstom decision. it was very much based on market share. It's true that Alstom and Siemens monopolized the market for high-speed trains in Europe. All trains, high-speed trains, are bought from either Siemens or Alstom. But it's what I believe it's a contestable market. You see what I mean? What a contestable market is that anybody could buy high-speed train from China if the price is too high. So it's true that they have the whole market, but it's a contestable market. So maybe she could prove me, she's not there, that the market was not so contestable. But then she has to make that case. And I didn't see that being commented in the Alstom Siemens. Again, they looked only at market share and market definition. They didn't look at whether this merger would prevent future entry and future innovation, which I think should have been the main criteria. So although we are better than the US, still, I mean, most of the time, I think Competition Commission in Europe does good work, but still we are too much based on market definition, market share, not enough on whether or not a merger and acquisition will prevent or future innovation, future entry. It's not sufficiently dynamic. And we can have a discussion on that. And, but I think we need to reform competition policy also in Europe. With China, trade with autocrats. Yeah, that's. I think what's important is that some people wanted to, say, well, all the factories we have in China, we should bring them back to France or to Europe. I think I would not do that. I think the way I would do is to innovate more. It's if you put high tariffs, too high tariffs, the destination country will retaliate and close export markets to you. But if they close export markets, it will reduce your own incentive to innovate. And therefore, you will lose control of value chains. So you have to be very careful when you manipulate tariffs. Alors, I believe, of course, in fair competition. If some countries turn into pollution heavens or into social dumping, or then you have to, of course, say, well, no, that's not right. WTO has to be played fairly. For example, on the environment, I am in favor of the threat of carbon tariffs against countries that turn into pollution heavens. It's true, for example, if some countries decide to say, you can come and pollute in my country and can re-export the goods, then, of course, you have to react. And the threat of carbon tariffs can be helpful there. But you have be very careful that it can be a pretext to protectionism. And if you become protectionist, it's a lose-lose game, because you will innovate less, and therefore you will have less power on the value chain. I think it's much more important to diversify. I think my response to the value chain and the loss of control on value chain is diversification and innovation. If you diversify and you innovate, you deal with a big part of the loss of control of global value chains. Of course, that doesn't prevent you from using the threat of carbon tariffs against pollution heaven. But that has to be done very carefully, otherwise it can be the pretext to get back to protectionism. And I don't think it's a good idea to have protectionist policy. I think, for example, Biden should take pretext of the current inflation to undo the very unfortunate increase in tariffs decided by Trump under the Trump regime. That would help lower inflation. I mean, that would be a right thing to do. I hope he will do it. I hope he will undo part of the tariffs that were set by Trump. That will put downward pressure, but I speak in front of the governor. If you would welcome such a move to lower tariffs, as one of the ways to lower inflationary pressure. But my view is that on value chains, protectionism is not the best response. Innovation and diversification is the best response. And I was asking on data. Data is a big part of new competition policy. It's all about, how to think about, merger and acquisition, more pro-innovation. It's a lot about data sharing. Those are new things that were not considered, when they decided to break up AT&T at the time. And those are, of course, data is a big part now of the work of Laura Veldkamp. I don't know if you know the work that she does on data. And it's very interesting. I think now she's looking into imperfect competition, but truly part of the new competition policy has to be how to force data sharing or to induce data sharing. That's certainly a big part of the...
Thank you. Probably on this side. Yes, it was here. 1, 2. Okay. Then I'll put myself as 3.
My question is, you mentioned monopoly rents. I just did a study that for Austria and Germany, monopoly rents are one of the main reasons why we have such high inflation rates, because a lot of companies, they get monopoly rents, especially in the energy sector. For example, Verbund, he doesn't innovate. He just gets much more for his energy because he has not cheap atomic power, but we have cheap water power. So isn't this a big problem? And then a short comment on for the climate, it's much worse to have a gas production for energy, produce it with gas instead of using coal. Because Russian gas is much worse than coal. Coal has more emissions of CO2, but we looked in the European Task Force on Carbon Pricing into it. The Russian gas has more methane emissions, and so it's worse than coal.
Thank you, and there was a point here.
Thanks, Professor, for a very energetic analysis. So, 2 questions. You've spoken a little bit about China. Could you speak more about this crypto-capitalist society and how they engage in the creative destruction? And number 2, do you think, given that there seems to be somewhat of an unlevel playing field at the moment, will the EU and my country, the US, will they be able to get back their competitiveness and compete with China? Thanks.
Thank you. So let me also add 2 points. One point where I slightly disagree with you is your presentation of the top 1%. Basically because this seems to me to be mixed. There's a mixture basically because there's a strong exploitation of network externalities in these super firms. Yeah? So the scale is almost inbuilt into the technological evolution here. And therefore the incumbency power increases dramatically, and this strong growth of the top 1% in the income scale reflects that. Yeah. So I'm a bit dubious about your graphs there, whether the speed and the volume of patenting really correlates or spuriously possibly correlates. Yeah, is it only the initial phase after you exploit? So I think this merger and acquisition process is almost the outcome of these strong scale effects for network. And the second point is just picking up what Birgit was saying. Are we living through a period which is not fully captured in your book, in a sense, where you have a cumulative effect of very strong shocks, yeah? And we experienced something like that in the interwar period, a deep contraction here, which obviously we had the golden age after the Second World War, but it took a long time to recover from that, yeah? So I wanted to ask you how do you deal with this cumulative nature of multiple shocks, which really can drive the destructive part of so strongly that it's very difficult to recover.
Thanks very much. Yeah, on the crypto, I haven't done much work on the crypto. I mean, I heard Jean Tirole last week talking about it and other people. The crypto has essentially bad sides. It may have a good side that it allows people, market size might increase a bit. Some people who would not do transactions, they do transactions in some circumstances. But I don't know if that market size effect is not counteracted by the fact that it's, that it's a money laundering device, that it has all the, it escapes regulations, and so I know Ken Rogoff has been advocating forbidding cryptos, but then you are much more on top. The governor is much more on top of that, and you are than I am. But the people I hear, talking about it, say that the overall effect is really detrimental. Even though you might have some people who do transactions who would not have done before. So from the point of view of innovation, it's true you might say market size matter for innovation, but on the other hand, it's you need rules, you need protection, you need rules to innovate, and there you escape. You go into very much the informal economy, and informality has never been a huge source of innovation, So I don't know what's your view on that, but overall I don't believe crypto is a big deal that will favor innovation much, in spite of a potential market size effect, which I'm dubious. EU compete with China is exactly the problem I had with Siemens Alstom. We were very much inward looking in our competition policy. In fact, in competition policy in Europe was done as an integration device. You see, for example, if a firm was dominant in France, it did not matter if it was not dominant in Europe. It could not be there dominant, because we were looking. It was done for political reason. We did competition policy as an integration device, like we did with the euro, also for political reason. It's never very good when you use an economic tool to achieve a political goal. And so as a result, competition policy in Europe became too much inward-looking, not sufficiently outward-looking. We should look at competition with China and the US before we look at whether a firm has a high market share in that country or not. You see what I mean? For me, the priority is to be outward-looking. And if something has to be corrected in the competition policy in Europe, is that now we have to realize we have to compete with US and China, and that should be a primary goal of our competition policy. It should be equally important, not just make sure that within Europe you have competition, which is also important. So that I thought was a thought that I had, and particularly with this case was clearly the Alstom Siemens, given that China produces high-speed trains and innovates on those, it's an obvious case in point. You were talking about incumbents. You always have the problem that incumbents, they grow they're big, and how you try to regulate the merger and acquisitions. And that's where this new competition policy that Richard Gilbert and others call for has to be implemented. That to make sure that by just looking at market share and not about the dynamic effects, you don't favor the emergence of big conglomerates. And in truth, there is a new agenda. There has been very little linking interpersonal income inequality to competition between firms. There is almost no data. I'm just starting now a project with Bunel and other co-authors where we merge firm-level data with interpersonal data to look at the extent to which the lack of competition is the main source of concentration of wealth at individual level. But there's been almost no work on that, and we are just starting to do it. But I think it's a huge area that you are referring to, where there's been essentially no work on. And I think that it's a crucial loophole to be filled up, to look at these two together. And the combination of shock, is true, we have the combination of shock. Of course, there's been a very interesting article, and I wanted to call the attention of the governor as well. In the most recent issue of the American Economic Review by Michael Woodford, who is one of our economists who understand best monetary policy on the theory side, he tells you when you have value chain problem, when you have, a problem of disruption of chains, interest rate may not be the only policy there. You may need to complement it more than ever with fiscal policy. And I think now a big challenge of macro, and I was holding a conference in Paris a week ago, honoring the memory of Emmanuel Fahy, who was a genius economist who killed himself 2 years ago. And he has these very important models where you look in detail into the input-output matrix and into the whole value chain, and where the disruption of the chain takes place. Because if the inflation is due to the fact that in some parts, the supply does not follow the demand, essentially, interest rate will not do much for you. You need other means, possibly smart industrial policy to increase supply, fiscal policy, but which is very much micro-founded. And my feeling is that the big challenge now is that to complement the usual monetary tools, you need to have this very micro-funded fiscal policy, because the interest rate alone will not deal with disruption of supply chains. They will not solve that problem. And very often it's because the supply does not follow the demand. And you don't want to discourage the supply further. So if you have a very disingenuous raise in interest rate, you might discourage supply raise, which will worsen the problem. They will make it less likely that supply will catch up with demand in some key areas where you have the bottlenecks. And it's very much there where we are now. And that opens, of course, a whole new set of issues. I think we'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Philipp. I think we had a very exciting evening. I think Philipp has probably influenced Austrian monetary policy this evening for a direct dialogue with the governor. We want to thank the Austrian Central Bank. I think there will be some refreshments outside and something to eat, I guess, also. Please take the opportunity to continue a discussion also with Philipp outside and with the other panelists. Is there anything the other panelists would like to add or make any? No. Yeah, you would like?
No. Thank you for the evening.
Yeah? Okay, then, Karl. So thank you very much for coming in on a very hot day, and you obviously had some other choices, but you came here to an exciting evening. And thank you, Philipp, for a very, very nice evening. Thank you. Okay. Philipp.